Matthew Bell with Alzheimer'sProof.com, and today I want to talk just a little bit more about activities of daily living. I've enumerated them before, but these are bathing yourself, dressing yourself, feeding yourself, transferring, so for example, getting in and out of bed, toileting by yourself, and number 6 is being able to maintain continence or controlling bladder and bowel function. I've mentioned them before in various other videos because they are highly relevant in conversations about different living situations. So for example, assisted versus independent living, you're going to have to grapple with the activities of daily living, or ADLs. In addition, long-term care insurance is very much bound up with discussions about ADLs. And the question of whether and when it is time to put a loved one into a nursing home is also bound to include some kind of consideration of the activities of daily living. But I've never focused exclusively on the ADLs in a video, so I thought I would spend a little bit of time and do that here. Number one, because there are some niceties, some subtleties, and some questions around the ADLs, and in addition to that, there's also something called the instrumental activities of daily living, or IADLs, and these are a bit different. In fact, they're considerably different. The activities of daily living are basic life functions, whereas the instrumental activities of daily living are, you can think of them as higher level functions, but we'll get into those in good time. So first, let me mention just something of historical interest. So the activities of daily living were first formulated, and the idea, the phrase activities of daily living, was first articulated by Dr. Sidney Katz, and he developed this. He was a doctor who operated for many, many years, I think several decades, 50 or 60 years even, and Dr. Katz in the 1950s started to develop the language and these metrics. In 1963, he published a very important paper in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, and the article was titled Studies of Illness in the Aged. And in that paper, he articulated the very first conception of these ADLs in terms of a systematic metric for assessing what he termed the index of independence. To this day, the language that he used is still in wide currency. In his scale, Katz's scale of ADLs is the standard, essentially. Now, as I said in the introduction, the activities of daily living, or the ADLs, represent basic life functions, but they can still, the words that I use, so for instance, bathing, dressing, and so on, can be understood to be shorthand for longer descriptions. Let me tell you what I mean. So for instance, bathing, the word bathing can be understood to be shorthand for personal hygiene, more broadly construed. Now this can be unpacked in a variety of different ways, which gives some rise to a little bit of interpretive difficulty, but it might encompass things like dental hygiene. It might encompass things like general grooming, hair care, skin care. It might encompass things like nail clipping and other kinds of tasks that go beyond just bathing and showering the way the word suggests. There's also a sense in which there is an appropriateness built into some of these things. So it's not just getting into the bathtub, but it's bathing appropriately, actually cleaning yourself effectively. This kind of appropriateness is going to be a part of each of the activities of daily living, arguably. So for instance, in terms of dressing yourself, it's not just being able to put some kind of fabric or garment on your body, but dressing yourself in a way that is appropriate to your climate, to the weather, and so on. A person who's wearing shorts and a t-shirt in a snowstorm, even though they manage to get clothes on their body, on one way of considering things anyway, wouldn't be dressed appropriately, and certainly may then just not qualify as being able to dress themselves. Things get a little bit sketchy because obviously there's the physical act of putting the clothes on, and then there is the cognitive act of gauging their appropriateness. Feeding, again, is straightforwardly essentially being able to lift, let's say, a fork to the mouth, being able to put bread in your mouth, being able to lift a water cup and drink from it. And in some cases, like in the case of feeding yourself, there is a kind of appropriateness that's built in, at least on a higher level. So for instance, if a person just ate nothing but crackers and drank water, even though they were feeding themselves, there is a question about how nutritious those meals would be and whether or not they are actually nutrifying themselves correctly. But I'm going to talk more about that when we get into the higher level instrumental activities of daily living in just a moment. There are a few other definitional issues that arise as well. So even though Katz's list is widespread, there are competing lists. So that's the first thing. And sometimes there are differences of opinion as to how to understand or how to unpack or cash out the shorthand. So for instance, we talked about bathing. Does bathing include grooming and styling your hair, or does it not? And there can be some kind of interpretive questions about that. Two doctors might disagree about what are actually included in the activities of daily living. A more serious one is transferring. So sometimes transferring is essentially and explicitly ignoring walking, and I've seen transferring and heard people define it as the ability basically to just simply go from a lying position in bed to a seated position, being able to pull yourself out of bed, maybe get into a wheelchair, something like that would count on one way of construing transferring. And on another way of construing transferring, it's essentially any kind of locomotion or movement to enable you to get from one place to another. So being able to get yourself out of bed, being able to ambulate or walk down the hall, by some definitions, is included under transferring. And in fact, there is an acronym that some people in the healthcare industry use to memorize these, and it's kind of morbid, but it's DEATH, D-E.A.T.H, and on that construal, the A actually stands for ambulating. And so some people learn the activities of daily living with an explicit reference to ambulating or walking. And again, other professionals say no, transferring is something different than walking, and walking is not an activity of daily living. So there's some dispute. There's also some questions regarding the grouping or listing of the activities in the first place. So for instance, is toileting a different ADL from continence, or are they the same thing? And it depends on the definition. Some professionals consider that being unable to control your bowel function means you lack toileting, versus some professionals say no, toileting is if you know you need to go to the bathroom and you're able to go and do everything that is necessary. So you're able to go into the bathroom, sit on the toilet, complete your business, get up from the toilet, and so on, versus continence is simply being able to control bowel and bladder functions so that you don't just evacuate without any kind of warning. Finally, there could also be questions about whether a person does lack a particular ADL or not, based on whether or not they can do an ADL with a mechanical aid of some kind or not. So for instance, can a person transfer, or if you're including ambulating, does a person count as being able to ambulate if they are using a walker or a wheelchair? Can a person transfer if we count them using or relying on a grab bar or a handrail? And in some cases, professionals will insist that if the use of a mechanical device is necessary, then a person lacks the ADL. And in other cases, they'll say, no, mechanical aid is fine. We're really concerned with people who have to rely on some kind of human assistance. So if you need human assistance in order to transfer, then you would lack the ADL. But if you can do it with the mechanical assistance, then you have the ADL, and other people disagree. So what you can somewhat see, in some cases there are levels of the ADL ability rather than just simply a simple yes or no. So can a person transfer? It's not necessarily yes or no. It's not necessarily pass or fail, so to speak, but it is maybe they can transfer under certain conditions with certain assistance devices, and so there's kind of a gradation that kind of develops out of that, which can complicate things. It can complicate not only the diagnosis, it can complicate the question of whether or not you could qualify to be in an independent living versus an assisted living facility. It can complicate questions about whether or not you're eligible or you qualify to receive or start receiving your long-term care insurance benefits if you have a policy. Now, these activities of daily living and these complications that I've just unpacked matter for a couple of reasons. The first one is somewhat academic, and that would be they matter for statistical reasons, for reasons of statistical record keeping. And what I mean is, the more broadly an activity of daily living is defined, the more that's included under that particular activity, the more people are going to count as disabled under that definition. But secondly, these differences matter because they affect eligibility or qualification for certain things. Again, like being able to get into a particular living situation, being able to collect on benefits from a long-term care insurance policy, possibly being able to collect government benefits. There are other factors that are relevant as well. So in some contexts, whether a person lacks an activity of daily living might be left to some kind of self-report. There might be some living situation applications that rely on self-reporting. So if you have a married couple and one person in that couple may start to diminish, whether it's cognitively or physically, but the married couple wants to be in an independent living facility, then one of the two might say on the application, no, we're fine, we can get along without assistance. The facility in some cases might not require that a facility certify that person as being able to perform all the activities of daily living. They might, in that context, simply take their word for it. But in other contexts, the activities of daily living can require doctor certification, or I should say certification from a qualified healthcare professional. It could be a doctor, usually, as I would suppose, whether or not the doctor is a geriatric specialist or some other practitioner. I think they would just have to be knowledgeable in this area. But there may be also other medical professionals who are likewise able. Possibly some therapists or occupational or physical therapists may be knowledgeable about these as well. Now, whether or not the physical therapist could certify a person, I think the doctor would have to do that. Now, finally, there are something called the instrumental activities of daily living. So I said again that these basic life functions, these basic activities of daily living like bathing and feeding and dressing are vital to everyday living. I mean, you can't stay alive if you're not protected against the elements and properly nutrified and so on. But in order to live a full life, you're going to want to have more than just the basic necessities of life covered. And so these instrumental activities of daily living are essentially ways to kind of bring in the idea of social or psychological fulfillment so that the person, and give a gauge as to how their general well-being might be assessed beyond just the basic life necessities. And so once again, these are going to be higher level functions. So they're going to include things like being able to maintain your own household. And in turn, that's going to include things like being able to clean your house, do your laundry, and so on. These are going to be functional activities, in other words. You're going to be able to manage your own finances by making sure you pay bills on time and writing checks and balancing the checkbook, keeping track of your taxes. And here's where meal preparation is going to come in. So preparing meals is going to be a higher level function than simply feeding yourself. And this is going to involve things like being able to use appliances correctly and safely, to safely assemble ingredients, to make sure that the meal is balanced and nutritious in all the appropriate ways. Another higher level function is going to be driving or being able to transport yourself from place to place or travel, maybe for business, maybe for pleasure. Additionally, many lists of these instrumental activities of daily living are going to include shopping, and that might be things like for clothing, for groceries, for household items. But you're also going to see references to communicating. That might be, in this day and age, through email, it might be through letter, it might be through telephone. And once again, these are going to be high-level functions that are going to take into consideration your overall well-being, including your psychological and your social connectivity and your social health. So a further consideration would be being able to handle your own healthcare matters. So scheduling appointments, taking medication by yourself, checking up with the doctor if you have problems, and so on. And they're also going to include a reference to companionship, to leisure activities, to recreation. And these might include activities like being able to play games, have conversations, celebrate holidays. Some of these things are going to dovetail, and I hope you can see that they're not hard and fast categories here. So for example, food preparation might be taken to dovetail with shopping, because obviously you're going to need to go to the store, select appropriate materials, bring them back to your place, store them correctly, and then once the food has been prepared, after you feed yourself, then you might even say it's going to start to include things like cleanup and proper disposal of all the scraps and garbage. And so maintaining a house, shopping, transportation, and driving, these things all sort of kind of bundle together, and that's common for these higher level functions because they're going to depend on one another in very important ways. Now, these instrumental and regular activities of daily living are going to play an essential role in diagnosis and in evaluation of a person who might have some kind of physical or cognitive impairment. Diagnostically speaking, the very first ones to be lost are going to be the higher level functions. So higher level functions will tend to erode first. So appointments are forgotten, bills go unpaid, chores go unfinished, the house gets messy, meals become unbalanced or not at all nutritious. and relationships are neglected. People might withdraw socially. So the loss of some of these instrumental activities of daily living, these higher level functions, might be some of the earliest signs of an impending cognitive impairment. They still might be mild cognitive impairment at that stage, but these are some of the earliest signs because they're some of the first abilities to erode. Then, as the impairment progresses, as the disease or condition progresses, you're going to find that even more basic functions begin to be lost as well. So the ability to perform the activities of daily living that we started off by saying, the fundamental basic activities of daily living, bathing and dressing and feeding and toileting and transferring and maintaining continence, the loss of those is going to be indicative of worse stage. That's the point at which a person may move into moderate impairment or middle stage Alzheimer's on the 3-stage view, and I have a video on the stages. Sometimes they're enumerated as 7, sometimes as 3, sometimes as 5. There's a number of different ways. And you can see my written article or the video on that topic if you're interested. Now, generally speaking, for example, for qualification for long-term care, there's a threshold. A person is supposed to lack 2 out of 6 activities of daily living before they are qualified or eligible to receive long-term care benefits. That 2 number is somewhat important in that regard, but as Alzheimer's or some other cognitive impairment or dementia progresses, then more of the ADLs are going to be lost until, if the person finally dies from that impairment, as my dad did, then they in all likelihood are going to lack all 6 of the activities of daily living. So in the end, my dad was completely non-ambulatory. He was completely bedridden, unable to move at all. He couldn't bathe himself. He couldn't feed himself, dress himself, transfer. He wasn't maintaining his own continence, and he couldn't toilet without assistance. But so Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia essentially strip a person's functions, their basic life functions and their functionality, from high-level functions all the way down to basic level functions if they live through an entire progression of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I know this topic wasn't pleasant, but if it helped you to maybe understand a little more fully the activities of daily living, I do invite you to please like the video, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell to be alerted to new content as it becomes available. I thank you so much for being with me today, and I look forward to seeing you again in another video.